History teaches that Hitler started World War II because he was evil and power-hungry. But that's a dangerous oversimplification. The truth is far more complex and terrifying. By September 1939, Hitler didn't just choose war. He was trapped by 7 converging crises that made invasion his only option. Economic fraud was about to explode. Military advantages were vanishing. Promises demanded fulfillment. And a genocidal ideology required the chaos of war to be implemented. This is the story of how 7 reasons built, converged, and finally detonated into the most destructive conflict in human history. What you're about to learn will change how you understand the origins of World War II forever. For 6 years before September 1939, Adolf Hitler had achieved remarkable territorial gains without firing a shot. Through diplomatic pressure, threats, and clever manipulation of European fears, he had remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and dismembered Czechoslovakia. Britain and France backed down every time, desperate to avoid another devastating war. The pattern was clear, and the strategy was working brilliantly. Germany was expanding its territory and power without the massive costs of military conflict. Then suddenly, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler abandoned this successful approach entirely. He ordered the invasion of Poland, triggering declarations of war from Britain and France. He gambled everything on military conflict when diplomatic pressure had been delivering consistent results. Why would a leader throw away a winning strategy? The answer isn't simple madness or pure evil. 7 distinct pressures were building beneath the surface, creating a perfect storm that made war inevitable by autumn 1939. Between 1933 and 1939, Nazi Germany spent over 60 billion Reichsmarks on weapons and military buildup. This figure was staggering for a country that just 4 years earlier had been devastated by the Great Depression. In 1933, when Hitler took power, 6 million Germans were unemployed, roughly 30% of the entire workforce. Industrial production had collapsed to just 58% of its 1928 levels. Banks failed, businesses closed permanently, and hunger became visible in every major city. Yet within 6 years, Germany had built one of the world's most powerful militaries from almost nothing. An army limited to 100,000 men under the Versailles Treaty now numbered 3.7 million troops, a 37-fold increase in peacetime. An air force that didn't officially exist in 1933 now possessed thousands of modern aircraft. Tank divisions rolled off assembly lines, while warships were under construction. The transformation was unprecedented in modern history, but this raised an obvious question that puzzled observers worldwide. How was this economically possible? The answer lay in brilliant financial trickery created by Hjalmar Schacht, the genius banker who served as Reichsbank president and economics minister. Schacht understood that money is organized belief. If people accept something as valuable, it has value, at least temporarily. His masterpiece was the MEO bill system, named after a shell company created purely to hide weapons spending. The Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or Metal Research Company, was founded in 1934 with just 1 million marks in nominal capital. The company existed only on paper with no actual operations. When the military needed weapons, manufacturers would draw bills of exchange on this MEO company instead of billing the government directly. The Reichsbank would then discount these bills, giving manufacturers immediate cash. Between 1934 and 1938, approximately 12 billion marks in MEO bills were issued, financing massive rearmament while hiding it from official scrutiny. The system allowed Germany to build a war machine without immediately triggering inflation or revealing the true scale of military spending to the world. But Schacht's system had one critical weakness. MEO bills had fixed 5-year maturity periods. When the bills matured, the government would have to pay with real money backed by gold or foreign exchange, not accounting tricks. The first MEO bills were issued in 1934, meaning they would come due in 1939. As early as 1937, Schacht began warning Hitler urgently that the system was approaching its limits. By 1938, the problem was undeniable. Approximately 12 billion marks worth of MEO bills would mature in 1939. Neither the Reichsbank nor the government possessed anything close to that amount in actual currency. Schacht's warnings became increasingly desperate through 1937 and 1938. He told Hitler the regime must either dramatically slow military spending or find new sources of revenue from conquests. When bills started maturing in 1939, Germany would face a brutal choice: admit the entire scheme was fraudulent and face catastrophic collapse, or somehow obtain massive new revenue from outside the existing system. In January 1939, Hitler's response was characteristic. He fired shocked. Beyond the MEO fraud, Germany faced severe resource shortages. The country produced almost no petroleum domestically, only about 10% of its oil needs, including early synthetic fuel production. Oil was the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare, powering tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ships. Germany had to import nearly all its oil from foreign sources that could be cut off in wartime. The list of critical shortages was extensive. Iron ore for weapons production had to be imported from Sweden. Copper for electrical wiring and shell casings came from abroad. Rubber for tires existed only in limited synthetic production, and dozens of specialized materials like tungsten, chromium, nickel, and molybdenum all required imports. In 1936, Hermann Göring launched an ambitious four-year plan to achieve economic self-sufficiency by 1940. It failed completely. 3 years later, Germany remained dangerously dependent on imports, with dependency actually increasing in some areas. The expanded military was systematically depleting resources that domestic production couldn't provide, and the gap widened every month. One statistic from 1938 captured the entire problem. 52% of all government spending went directly to the military. This was a full wartime economy during peacetime. Developed nations usually spent 10 to 15% of budgets on military forces during peace, with 20% considered high and 30% indicating war preparation. Germany was spending like it was already at war without acquiring new resources or territory. Living standards that had genuinely risen between 1933 and 1936 began reversing by 1939. Rationing was quietly introduced for consumer goods and food. Wages fell while prices rose. The famous slogan, "Guns instead of butter," became literal economic policy, with resources forcibly diverted from consumer production to military manufacturing. Even Goebbels' sophisticated propaganda machine could only mask harsh economic reality for so long. Without major external victories to justify the sacrifices, domestic discontent would inevitably grow. The bills were mounting, resources depleting, and the system consuming itself. Germany faced a brutal choice: drastically cut military spending and face collapse, or seize resources through conquest. How did this system even begin? On February 20th, 1933, just 3 weeks after Hitler became chancellor, approximately 25 of Germany's most powerful businessmen received urgent summons to Hermann Göring's villa in Berlin. The group included representatives from IG Farben, Krupp, and other industrial giants. Hitler kept them waiting, then delivered a 1-hour speech with a single theme: democracy and private enterprise could not coexist. One had to go. He announced that after the March 5th elections, there would be no retreat regardless of the outcome. Göring then explained that German business should make appropriate financial contributions to the Nazi election campaign, adding a remarkable promise: the March 5th election would surely be the last for the next 10 years, probably for the next 100 years. This wasn't a friendly request, it was an implicit threat. Over 3 weeks, businesses contributed 3 million Reichsmarks. IG Farben gave 400,000 marks, the largest single donation. The businessmen had effectively financed the end of German democracy, becoming willing partners in what came next. Within months, the regime moved beyond collecting money to seizing direct control. On October 17, 1933, Dr. Hugo Junkers was arrested at his vacation home. Junkers was Germany's leading aviation pioneer, operating the country's largest aircraft factory. The official charge was treason, but the real reason was simpler. Hermann Göring wanted control of his plant. After 24 hours in detention, Junkers signed away his firm to the Reich. He had no choice. Managerial control was immediately placed in government hands, and Junkers was removed completely from the company he had built. This was one of the most blatant acts of coercion applied to any non-Jewish business in Third Reich history, establishing an unmistakable precedent. If Nazi leadership wanted your factory, they would take it. However, outright seizures were rare. The regime preferred maintaining the appearance of private enterprise while establishing complete state control through an elaborate system of compulsory business organizations that gave officials direct supervision over every aspect of economic life, touching every transaction in the German economy until 1945. In March 1934, Hitler held a crucial meeting at his mountain retreat. The economics minister and finance minister had agreed beforehand not to approve more than 15 billion Reichsmarks for rearmament. At the meeting, the economics minister began explaining financial constraints and the harsh reality of Germany's foreign exchange crisis. Then Schacht interrupted, announcing that no amount of money was too much for rearmament. He declared his willingness to ruin the currency in pursuit of military buildup. Hitler sided with Schacht immediately. By June 1934, the Reichsbank's foreign currency reserves had dropped below 100 million Reichsmarks, barely enough to cover 1 week of imports when 6 months were needed. Germany was effectively bankrupt. On June 14, 1934, Germany declared it would stop paying its international debts. 2 days later, the Reichsbank abandoned monthly foreign exchange rationing, switching to daily allocation. Britain's parliament held an emergency session, threatening economic war. On June 28, the economics minister was giving a speech when he suddenly collapsed, asking aloud, "What is to be done?" Nobody knew the answer. To understand Hitler's economic thinking, historians studied his unpublished 1928 writings. These revealed completely false beliefs about how the world economy worked. Hitler believed the global economy was heading toward inevitable collapse. He was convinced that international trade would fail and that only nations with huge territories and resources could survive. This wasn't abstract philosophy, it was core reasoning that made him think Germany had no choice except conquest. Hitler operated on a false economic theory that the global market was a fixed pie that would eventually shrink as other nations industrialized. He believed trade was a death spiral, and that Germany could only survive by becoming a self-sufficient continental power like the United States with vast living space, or Lebensraum. In his view, smaller industrialized nations like Britain and Germany would inevitably lose access to markets and resources. The only solution was territorial expansion to create a self-sufficient economic bloc. This delusion drove every major economic decision from 1933 onward, making war seem not just desirable, but economically necessary for survival. By 1939, German intelligence revealed a terrifying reality. The temporary military advantage was disappearing. While Germany held an edge in 1939, Britain and France were rearming at rates that would surpass German capacity by 1941 or 1942. British aircraft production jumped from 2,800 planes in 1938 to 8,000 in 1939. French tank production was accelerating. The Soviet Union was industrializing rapidly. American industrial capacity, if mobilized, would dwarf anything Germany could produce. German military planners understood that waiting meant fighting from a position of increasing weakness. Every month of delay allowed enemies to narrow the gap. By 1942, the balance would shift decisively against Germany. This created enormous pressure to act while the window remained open. Hitler faced a strategic dilemma: strike now while holding temporary advantages, or wait and face opponents who would be stronger in every measurable category. Combined with the economic crisis reaching its breaking point in 1939, the vanishing military advantage made immediate war seem like the only rational choice from the regime's distorted perspective. The Nazi regime's legitimacy rested fundamentally on the promise of Lebensraum, living space in the East. This wasn't merely rhetoric, but the core mission justifying the dictatorship and the enormous sacrifices demanded from the German people. For 16 years since the publication of Mein Kampf in 1925, Hitler had promised that Germany would expand eastward, conquering Poland and Russia, to provide land for German settlers. After bloodless victories in Austria and Czechoslovakia, the momentum of the Nazi movement demanded the final move toward Poland and beyond. The ideology couldn't tolerate endless delay. Supporters who had endured economic hardship, rationing, and repression had been promised that these sacrifices would lead to territorial expansion and national greatness. By 1939, after 6 years in power, Hitler needed to deliver on these core promises or risk losing credibility with his base. The ideological imperative for Lebensraum wasn't separate from economic necessity. It was intertwined. The promised Eastern territories would provide the resources, markets, and self-sufficiency that Hitler's false economic theories said Germany desperately needed. Nazi expansion was fundamentally different from traditional conquest because it required the removal or elimination of inferior populations to clear land for German settlers. This genocidal mission couldn't be implemented during peacetime under international scrutiny. War provided necessary cover and chaos for mass murder. The concentration camp system was already fully prepared by 1939, having been tested and refined on political prisoners, Jews, and other targeted groups within Germany. The invasion of Poland would expand this system dramatically. German planners understood that acquiring Lebensraum meant dealing with millions of Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, and Jews already living on the desired territories. The Nazi racial ideology demanded these populations be eliminated, enslaved, or driven eastward. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of war. It was a central goal. War created conditions where genocide could be implemented systematically without effective outside intervention. The chaos of combat, the collapse of normal legal structures, and the fog of war all provided cover for atrocities that would have been impossible during peacetime. By August 1939, Germany had mobilized 1.5 million men at enormous daily cost. Soldiers had been pulled from factories and farms. Equipment was positioned at the Polish border. The entire military machine was coiled for invasion. At this stage, calling off the operation would have been catastrophic for Hitler's authority and the regime's credibility. The Nazi-Soviet pact signed on August 23, 1939, had neutralized the threat of a two-front war, providing a strategic opening. Stalin agreed not to intervene if Germany attacked Poland, and the two dictators secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. This pact shocked the world and removed Germany's greatest strategic fear. With the Soviet threat temporarily neutralized, Britain and France isolated, and German forces mobilized, Hitler faced a moment where all conditions aligned for invasion. Demobilizing would mean admitting weakness, wasting the resources spent on mobilization, and missing the strategic window. The mobilization itself had created an inescapable trap where only war offered a path forward. The momentum had become irreversible. By September 1, 1939, all 7 pressures had reached critical mass simultaneously. The MEO bills were coming due with no way to pay them except through seizing foreign gold and resources. The nationalized war economy had consumed all available domestic resources and needed new territories to plunder. Hitler's false belief in shrinking markets made him think waiting was economic suicide. Intelligence showed the military window of advantage was closing rapidly. Ideological promises of Lebensraum demanded fulfillment after 6 years of sacrifice. The genocidal mission required war's chaos to be implemented, and mobilization had created its own momentum that couldn't be reversed without catastrophic consequences. These weren't 7 separate problems. They were interconnected crises that reinforced each other. Economic fraud required conquest for resources. Resource needs aligned with ideological goals. Ideological goals required military action. Military action needed to happen before the window closed. And mobilization made retreat impossible. Hitler didn't choose war from strength. He was trapped by converging crises that left invasion as the only path that appeared to offer survival. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. The Luftwaffe bombed Polish cities while panzer divisions smashed through defensive positions. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein bombarded Polish positions at Westerplatte. Within hours, Poland was reeling from the coordinated assault. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, honoring their commitments to Poland. World War II had officially begun. The invasion was overwhelming in its speed and violence. German forces employed blitzkrieg tactics, lightning war, combining air power, armor, and mobile infantry in coordinated assaults that shattered Polish defenses. Within weeks, Poland would be defeated and divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, which invaded from the east on September 17th. But the quick victory over Poland didn't solve Germany's fundamental problems. The economic fraud still needed massive resources. Britain and France were now active enemies. The military window was still closing, and the genocidal mission was just beginning its horrific implementation across occupied territory. Hitler had gambled that Britain and France would back down again, just as they had over Austria and Czechoslovakia. He believed the Western powers lacked the will to fight a major war over Poland. This calculation was partly correct. For several months, the war in the West remained relatively quiet in what became known as the Phony War. French and British forces mobilized but didn't launch major offensives against Germany. However, Hitler had fundamentally miscalculated the long-term situation. Britain and France were now committed to war. They began mobilizing their economies and expanding their militaries. The United States, while officially neutral, was clearly sympathizing with the Allies. The quick victory over Poland didn't provide the massive economic resources Germany needed. Poland was relatively poor and had limited industrial capacity. The real resources Hitler wanted lay further east in the Soviet Union, but invading his temporary ally would require breaking the Nazi-Soviet pact. The conquest of Poland had solved none of the 7 underlying crises. It had merely postponed the reckoning while adding new enemies. The invasion of Poland triggered an escalating spiral that would eventually consume 60 million lives. Each conquest created new needs that required further conquests. Defeating Poland required attacking Norway and Denmark to secure iron ore supplies and naval bases. Conquering Scandinavia led to invading France and the Low Countries to protect Germany's western flank. Victory over France required attempting to bomb Britain into submission. When Britain refused to surrender, Germany needed to secure Mediterranean oil and Balkan resources. This eventually led to invading Yugoslavia and Greece. And underlying everything was the ultimate goal, the invasion of the Soviet Union to seize the Lebensraum and resources that Hitler had always demanded. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, breaking the Nazi-Soviet pact and invading the USSR with over 3 million men. This was the war Hitler had always intended, the conquest of living space in the East and the destruction of what Nazi ideology termed Judeo-Bolshevism. But by attacking the Soviet Union while still at war with Britain, Germany ensured the two-front war that would ultimately destroy it. The 7 reasons that forced Hitler into war in 1939 contained the seeds of Germany's ultimate defeat. The economic fraud couldn't be sustained even with conquest. Occupied territories had to be exploited so brutally they became sources of resistance rather than resources. The nationalized war economy was inflexible and couldn't match the productive capacity of the United States and Soviet Union once they fully mobilized. Hitler's false beliefs about shrinking markets meant he never understood how modern industrial economies actually worked. The vanishing military window proved partially illusory. Germany burned through its temporary advantages in brutal campaigns, while enemies grew stronger. Ideological promises required such massive territorial conquests that Germany created enemies everywhere. The genocidal mission diverted resources from the war effort, murdered millions of potential workers, and guaranteed that occupied populations would resist rather than collaborate. And the momentum of mobilization meant Germany could never stop expanding until it was destroyed. The same pressures that made war seem necessary in 1939 ensured that war would ultimately result in Germany's total defeat. Understanding why Hitler started World War II matters because it reveals how complex historical forces interact to produce catastrophe. Evil ideology alone doesn't explain the timing or necessity of the invasion. Economic fraud, resource dependency, false economic theories, military calculations, ideological promises, genocidal goals, and mobilization momentum all converge simultaneously to create a situation where war seemed like the only option. This doesn't excuse or minimize Nazi crimes. The Holocaust and aggressive war remain monstrous evils. But understanding the specific pressures Hitler faced helps explain why he made the choices he did when he did. It also offers lessons for preventing future conflicts. Economic fraud creates desperation that leads to reckless decisions. False ideologies produce disastrous policies. Resource dependencies create vulnerabilities. Military windows create pressure to act rashly, and mobilization creates momentum that becomes impossible to reverse. The 7 reasons that forced Hitler into war in 1939 remain relevant warnings about how multiple crises can converge to make catastrophe seem inevitable. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar dangerous patterns before they explode.